9. Virtual murder. Winterdawn falls. This being only a couple of days after the Grosvenor march, he is staring at the woman who will be his wife, and it occurs to him what a startlingly beautiful woman she is, and he doesn't know her name. So who are they? Funny people or 5? They'll stop this work over my dead body. Did you get the number of that maniac? He looked familiar. Perception of the immortal soul crosses his mind. It is an egg. He finds himself hanging upside down for no immediately apparent reason. The world is running in slow motion, a bead of blood gradually seeping from his leg, moulding itself into a perfect spheroid and gently descending to impact on the cover of the John Pilger book Jenny keeps on the dashboard. The blood explodes, flattening itself across the cover, and he finds himself staring into the face of his wife again, and again it occurs to him what a startlingly beautiful woman she is, and it occurs to him that while his wife is strapped into the seat beside him, her beautiful head is lying in a ditch by the roadside, not 3 yards away. Winterdawn begins to scream. The doctor falls. 13 shafts of cold obsidian, hollow and rotting, that is my soul, my soul, my soul, damn you, my soul, and it is not theirs to take. There is only one thing, only one and one alone. I am the light and the resurrection. I am the devil come to do the devil's work. I am Faust, come from a race of Fausts, who sold our souls for 13 long lives, while others drop like mayflies, and come friendly bombs and drop on Gallifrey. I hated that world. I hated it all. I swear to protect the ancient law of Gallifrey with all my might and main, and to the end of my days I will, with justice and with honour, temper my actions and my thoughts. I am a kind man who never uses violence where it is not necessary. I am never cruel or cowardly. Violence always rebounds on itself. I love life. It becomes necessary to seek out and entrap evil in order to destroy it before its twisted roots blossom. If innocents suffer, that is a sad consequence of my action. The greatest good for the greatest number life is expendable. My enemies will be exterminated. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. My companions, you gave me my life, and sometimes you gave me yours too. I loved you all. I never want you to leave, because it is like death for me. How many times have I died? How many lives have I cut away from myself through pursuit of righteousness, regardless of consequence? And how many resurrections staged? I am an old man who is about to die young. Raise my body to a burning cross. I have fought evil, and evil has made me. And in the scheme of reality, I am what I am. I am not a Time Lord. I reject the title. I am myself. I am a doctor, a healer, a good man. I've got nothing to say, but what a day. How's your boy been? Good morning, good morning, good morning. Believe me, believe me, believe me. We are but shadows, and shadows of shadows. Winterdawn seizes the arms of his chair, fingernails digging into the leather upholstery, a desperate effort to steady himself. Believe me, the doctor whispers, tears leaving long stains on his face. Winterdawn found himself gasping for breath. The experience had left him exhausted and exhilarated, pleasure and pain entwined together. He threw his head back and breathed heavily. The experience had lasted for no time and forever. It couldn't be compared to such limited concepts. It just was. I think, it was the doctor's voice, but it seemed strange and new to Winterdawn. Our ordeal is over. Oh God, yes, Winterdawn replied between breaths. What did you see? No, don't tell me. I don't want to know. Where are we? Nowhere and everywhere, Winterdawn, the doctor replied, his voice rich with confidence. In the heart of darkness. Winterdawn let his eyes slip open and stared into the infinite. And the infinite stared back at him. Interstitial space unfolded. It was an incomprehensible sight. For a second, Winterdawn's mind rejected everything around him, and he was plunged into a shroud of darkness. Then the shroud slipped. Winterdawn was reminded of a kaleidoscope. A banal analogy, but the best he could manage. The colours were clear and precise and sharp. They sang. Floating and merging and swirling into a whirlpool. Even the colourlessness was beautiful. Winterdawn had never realised that grey could contain so many tones and shades and mixtures. He blinked, and everything was obsidian, shiny, brilliant blackness, then white, then chessboard, then pale green like a rough sea journey. Winterdawn threw back his head and howled. Yes, he screamed at the sky. I have abstracted reality. I have unbound the quantum Prometheus. I did it. He brought his hands together in a single motion. A thunderclap shook the scenery. Doctor, you don't know how this makes me feel. This is wonderful. I feel... Jesus, what a load of crap. I feel amazing. I want to sing and dance. He slapped his hands against the back of his head, his enthusiasm waning. And dance! Anyway, he continued, outlining his plans for the Doctor's benefit, this is the beginning. From here, we can access any time-space event in history. We could travel to alien galaxies in a matter of seconds. There'll be matter transmission, interreal travel, maybe even time travel. It begins here. A scientific, social, and metaphysical revolution. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with but a single step. I couldn't have put it better myself, Winterdawn smiled. Shall we explore? The Doctor smiled thoughtfully, and Winterdawn, not expecting anything other than a positive response, took this as a yes. There should be a gate around here somewhere, he said, our link back to reality. Generated by the tetrahedron. That's right. In turn, operated by Harry Truman. Winterdawn nodded. I see, the Doctor replied. Perhaps, yes. He stretched an arm into the psychedelia. His fingertips seemed to penetrate the skin of the interstices, sinking into invisibility. His knuckles, hand, wrist, and arm were consumed by the envelope of interstitiality. Pain flashed across his face, vanishing as suddenly as it appeared. Winterdawn had a brief glimpse of tremendous momentary effort. Then nothing. The Doctor's arm returned. A shape sat on his hand. It was an oval cut into the side of reality, filled with glowing colours as bright and clear as anything else in the gap, yet fixed like a stained glass window. The gate suggested immutability, stasis, order in the chaos that surrounded them. Gradually, it dawned on Winterdawn that the oval was not in the Doctor's palm, but distant. His sense of perspective was eroding. A wonderful feeling. You see, it was there all the time, the Doctor smiled irritatingly. We just had to look for it. This is our lifeline back to normality. I suggest we don't stray too far. Winterdawn smiled. It's Truman, isn't it? Okay, maybe you've reason to dislike him, but he's basically a good man. Trust me. The Doctor was silent, his face shorn of features. Shall we go? Winterdawn asked, after a moment's silence. After you, the Doctor suggested. Come on, give us a push. The darkness was unwholesome. The usual musty scent was tinged with something sick, a familiar but elusive scent which made Ace's flesh shudder. It scared her. Bernice's fears had something going for them after all. A couple of hours down here, and even she'd be a gibbering wreck. Her torch beam punctured the darkness. It shed a little light on her surroundings, but enough. Benny was ahead, trying to find something familiar. Ace let her beam dance on Benny's back and followed her lead. This looks familiar, Benny called. Very familiar. Try singing. It can only inspire me. I've got a bloody good voice, Ace protested. I'm sure it went down well with the deaf community of Perivale. I'd like to hear you do Ace broke off suddenly. Her right foot had sunk into something soft, wet, cold, unpleasant. She shook her leg violently, but the offensive article refused to budge. Shit, she muttered. What is it? I've put my foot in something. That's nothing new. Can it wait? I think I've found... Just give us a light, Ace snapped. Okay, Benny muttered. Her torchlight swung round and struck Ace painfully between the eyes. And in the darkness, God said, Oh, shit! The light snapped off. A Benny-shaped shadow disappeared into the dark. What is it now? Ace called, feeling the hounds of anger straining on the ends of their leashes. Ace? Benny's voice was a quivering cocktail of hysteria, revulsion, and horror. It's someone's head. The tetrahedron's inner light pulsed smoothly and slowly. It never failed to relax or soothe Truman. He was even beginning to feel kinder towards the doctor and his entourage. Maybe he was wrong. His problem, he felt, was a lack of empathy. He rarely considered other people's motivations. There were still some doubts whispering at the back of his mind, but he let these slip away, losing himself in the pulse of the pyramid. Something soft lighted on his shoulder, a small, warm hand. He let his gaze swing upwards and welcomed the sight of Sandra Winterdawn. She was standing over him, smiling at him with a warmth that Truman felt he hadn't seen before. He tried to return that warmth from behind his mask. "Hello, Harry," Sandra said gently, and her voice had a new smoothness, an exciting emphasis. "Can we talk? I mean, you have to work this thing." Truman shook his head. "It works itself. I watch in case it does something wrong. Sit down, please." Sandra lowered herself into a squat on the far side of the tetrahedron. Truman found his attention caught briefly by her bare legs, uncovered just below the hem of her dressing gown. Checking himself before his obsession became obvious, he raised his gaze and was entranced by Sandra's face. If it wasn't one thing, it was something else. Not that he minded. "You know," Sandra began, picking her words with undisguised awkwardness, "how close I was to Justin before he began to lose himself." Truman nodded, grateful for the mask which hid his expression and the guilt that came with it. "I first met him 7 years ago. I loved him then. He was a wonderful lover, and I ignored his faults." She paused to glance around the room. When she resumed, her voice was disjointed, stumbling wildly through her words. "My affection dried up long before his madness developed. He hurt me. Not physically, but he was screwing up my mind, and I stuck with him. I should have thrown him out, but I didn't, and I don't know why." "I don't think I should be listening to this," Truman whispered, taking advantage of Sandra's pause to voice his fears. He felt like he was breaking a taboo, rummaging around in her soul. "Please, it's important," Sandra smiled. Truman nodded resignedly. "He was an emotional wreck. He'd do anything to get me the way he wanted. I don't think I saw that then, but I knew something was wrong. I knew I was losing something. Then, of course, his mind cracked. Don't know why, don't care. You turned up soon after. You know the rest. I was devoted to him. I nursed him back to health, even though I knew he'd be just as bad as before. And having restored some measure of his sanity, I watched everything collapse after 5 bloody minutes in Dad's experiment. 5 minutes! Wonderful! 1.5 years of putting up with a harmless nut, 6 months of working on his mind. 5 minutes. And not for 1 second of all that time did I love him. I'd lost that. It was gone, and it's never coming back." "I see," Truman replied softly. "Why do you—" Sandra pressed a finger to the mouth of his mask. Instantly he fell silent. "Justin is my patient, not my lover. Not any more." Light tears began to bloat under her eyelids. "Harry, I know more about you, about how you feel, than you realize yourself. When I was 18, I thought I'd found a bloody good bloke. And he was, but he was also immature and spiteful. You're like him, as he could have been if he'd grown up. You're better than he was." Truman let his tongue roll around the inside of his open but invisible mouth. "What are you trying to say exactly?" "Oh, for Christ's sake, you stupid bastard! Do I have to spell it out for you?" Sandra screeched, tears flowing freely now. "Don't you know what you want, how you feel? I know, and I want it too." "You are being serious, aren't you?" A face red with anger and frustration screamed at him. Yes! Yes! I'd screw you on the floor here and now if it wasn't for the absolute certainty that Dad and that weirdo doctor would come rolling out of the wardrobe in the middle of it. I love you, you gormless git." She jerked her head out of eye contact, breathing heavily. Truman waited, shocked, for her to recover her composure. Delighted too and excited, but mostly shocked. There was a suddenness and certainty to the proceedings which left him numb. Suddenly, everything was right with the world. His desire was in reach. It was too much to take in one go. Sandra turned back to him, her face a normal, beautiful pale white. She'd wiped the tear stains away. "Do you understand now?" she asked, voice little more than a whisper. "Yes," Truman replied, "but I can't believe it." "Yes, you can. Touch me somewhere you really want to." Truman thought briefly about all the parts of her he wanted to touch, and nervously settled on that one place for which his desire overrode everything. There. Tentatively, as if he was about to handle something rare and delicate, and he was. He let his hands brush against her face. One light palm pressing against her cheek, the other cupping itself under her chin. Sandra leaned back, her eyes closed, her breathing deep. Truman began to move his hands, stroking her face as delicately as he could possibly manage. Her skin was warm and slightly damp with sweat. It was a good thing, the best thing Truman had known in his life. "Don't stop," Sandra was whispering, repeating it like a holy chant. He had to in the end, withdrawing his hands in slow motion. Sandra opened her eyes and stared at him. He stared back, wondering what to do now. Sandra leaned closer, pushing her head towards his. Instinctively, Truman let his head swing round to meet hers, their faces locking together in a perfect, passionate motion. Sandra's soft lips pressed forcefully against cold, dead wood, an inanimate grin, the lips of the false face. Truman could feel the pressure of her beautiful mouth through the hole in the mask. It was a second before that pressure became unbearable. He dragged himself away from her, pulling away from her grip, burying his face, his mask, behind writhing hands. He screamed at the frustration, at the injustice, at the insides of the mask. "Take it off!" It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. He stared at Sandra through the sockets of the mask, watching her pull round to face him. "Take it off!" "I can't!" Truman mustered as much calm as he could manage. He stabbed a finger viciously to his temple. "Here is a mess. You don't want to know, believe me." "No," Sandra replied in the same steel voice. "I do. Take it off now." "No!" Truman screamed, desperately shaking his head. "Then I will." Hands clamped themselves onto the side of the mask and wrenched with an unexpected strength. The mask flew away from his face. Sandra flinched as she saw his face, but it was momentary, and it disappeared with the speed of its arrival. There was silence, encapsulated in a second. "You're beautiful," Sandra said. "You're lying," he accused. "You can't see properly." "I wouldn't lie, and I can see perfectly." Truman found himself kissing her before he realized what he was doing. It was a wonderful feeling to kiss again, to kiss properly for the first time, made more wonderful still by Sandra. She wasn't repulsed. She was enjoying it. Enjoying! They broke off simultaneously, staring into each other's eyes with a new understanding. "Stop shaking," Sandra insisted, smiling with a vicious and exhilarating arrogance. She closed her eyes, and in the single most sensual movement Truman had ever seen, peeled away the top of her gown to reveal beautiful milk-white shoulders. Truman just stared. He never understood quite what happened next. There was a flurry of limbs and wild actions, and suddenly Truman found himself lying on his side on the floor, half pinned down by Sandra, her thighs wrapping around his hips. Her dressing gown had mostly slipped away, revealing far more of her wonderful body than he had ever hoped to see. Everything crystallized into a single moment stretching into forever. Truman leant forward, pushing a hand under one of Sandra's breasts, his lips against hers. Everything was perfect, and eternity was blown away by a modest cough. A meaningful cough from the other side of the room. The moment unravelled. Truman looked up. There were two figures, two utterly normal and utterly unfamiliar figures. Truman stared at them in disbelief, feeling no guilt, no shame. He wondered why they seemed so ridiculous. "And what will Daddy say if he catches you?" the male figure asked. Truman stared at the man's hand. The man was holding up the tetrahedron for him to see. The tetrahedron light was dying, pulsing slow and dim. In another facet of reality, Winterdawn knew. His head snapped up in alarm. "The gate!" he yelled. "The gate is closing!" The doctor was already spinning the wheelchair round, shoving it with vicious energy. The chair hurtled back at immeasurable speed. Kaleidoscopic unreality became phantasmagoric truth, colour blurring around them like a tunnel of blazing light. The gap became focused by their thoughts, their desire to reach the gate. It was visible in the distance, a pinpoint of fixed colour. The light at the end of the tunnel, Winterdawn snatched wildly at his random, incoherent thoughts, is the headlamp of an oncoming train. "How do we know?" the doctor screamed, voice caught in the slipstream, absorbed into the sound and momentum of the tunnel. "We don't know," Winterdawn howled back, uncertain whether the doctor could hear. "We feel." It sounded hollow, facile even. A burst of optimistic rationalism surged inside him. Maybe it was a false alarm, a panic reaction to some extra-real phenomena, anything so long as the gate was there. It wasn't. Stained glass colours flared at the end of the tunnel. The light streaked. And then there was no light, no colour, no tunnel, no sound, no urgency, no gate. The doctor pulled the wheelchair to a halt, though it felt to Winterdawn that they were spinning unguided through the dark like a space capsule out of orbit. They hurtled past meaningless grey shapes that pierced the gloom. One of the grey shapes was the doctor. He was larger and darker than Winterdawn remembered. Winterdawn hugged himself as an icy hopelessness cut through him. "I'm sorry." The doctor's voice was light. "I was too slow." "No, we were too far. We couldn't have made it in time." The doctor became a brooding shape on the edge of his vision. Winterdawn also fell silent, because there was nothing to say. Then there was. "You understood Truman better than I did." The doctor shook his head slowly. "No, you were right. I don't think this is deliberate. I don't know. Truman fascinates me." "He does? He always seemed perfectly normal to me." "Normal?" The doctor swung round so that Winterdawn caught a sudden blast of sharp features. "How long have you known that he isn't human?" Truman extricated himself from Sandra's tangled limbs. The strangers didn't move, nor did Sandra. She lay on the floor, half covered by her gown, watching the newcomers in meek abeyance. Truman was reacting. The shock faded, replaced by anger and shame at the shattering of his private moment, of Sandra's moment, their moment of intimacy. But even his anger was counterbalanced by his curiosity. "How did you get into this house?" His voice shook, restrained. "Through the front door. Miss Winterdawn let us in." "No, she wouldn't let strangers in." Truman surprised himself with his reasonable tone. "Oh, she knows us," the man replied. "Not as well as you know us." "I don't know you," Truman snapped. But he began to doubt what he was saying. There was something familiar about the pair. They were immaculate. They were beautiful. Truman had never seen a more attractive woman than the blonde standing in front of him. Not even Sandra, though her sexuality was lined with an icy physical humour that Truman found repellent. There was something in their appearance that was sickening. Flesh too pale, features too precise, too perfect to be genuinely attractive. They were there, in his deepest, darkest memories. "I know you?" Anger evaporated, replaced by fear. "Forgive us," the woman replied. "Our manners are so very coarse. I am Tanith, and this is my brother Gabriel." "Harry Truman," Truman replied weakly, automatically. "No," Gabriel insisted. "Harry Truman does not exist." "I exist?" It was a statement of fact, no argument. "You exist. Harry Truman doesn't," Tanith pointed out. "Then who am I?" he laughed, bewildered and afraid. Gabriel's reply was soulless and deadpan, and Truman realized, true. "You're Justin Cranley." Truman made tiny shakes of the head, but it was self-denial. Tanith was talking, but he didn't take it in, only the gist, the bare bones. Justin Cranley was a vain and stupid man, a man whose mind worked on such a simple level that he was the perfect victim for Gabriel and Tanith's mental attack. It came quickly but viciously. They used his mind as a blueprint. Minor background details they changed, memories they blurred. They drove a block through his mind, a trauma, a terrible accident, a fiction to cover the memory gaps. In the process, Cranley was driven insane. A side effect. Gabriel and Tanith noted it, regretting nothing. They took Cranley's revised mind and shaped it, built a body from the stuff of chaos from interstitial space, the building blocks of reality. This proved a partial success. Their creature seemed perfect, but his body structure was unstable. There were physical defects. But it lived. Several weeks after Cranley went mad, Truman arrived in response to an advertisement. The two identical minds had a certain rapport, but no one saw the similarities. Cranley himself had only made stabs at the truth in the darkest moments of his madness. Tanith stopped talking. Truman let his body sink into itself. "Why?" "You were a prototype," Gabriel announced, "for a project we are about to launch in this house." Truman didn't care. He could no longer care. "You are a great achievement," Tanith told him. "You're Justin Cranley as he might have been. Compared to him, you're a saint." "Look," Gabriel pointed at Sandra. "She loved you more than she ever loved him. We didn't make her feel anything. All we did was remove her inhibitions. She was a distraction, but not a hollow one." "I see," Truman continued, pulling himself up in an attempt to regain his dignity. "You're going to kill me, aren't you?" "How can we kill you? You were never alive to begin with." "We are going to dissolve your body," Gabriel said, without a hint of emotion or relish. "Your mindset will be reabsorbed by Cranley." "And that will restore his sanity?" "No." Tanith's retort was dull, but Truman had caught the hint of a smile twitching on the edge of her lips. "Just one thing," Truman said. "You say my accident never happened. What about my face?" "Look," Gabriel said, and brought the tetrahedron up to Truman's face. In each surface he saw his face reflected. His face was no face. From chin to hairline, ear to ear, there was nothing but blank flesh. "I saw the scars," he said. This wasn't enough to shock him, not now. "You saw what you wanted to see," Gabriel said. "Your mind could shape your face briefly. That's how you managed to eat and talk and see and kiss." He rolled to a halt, then checked himself. Sandra saw a blank, but she didn't care. It was your face. She thought it was beautiful. Truman nodded and smiled, imagined a smile. "Goodbye, Truman," Tanith said suddenly. "I liked you." She raised her fist and pushed it into Truman's head. Truman felt no pain, no fear, no anguish, just a gentle suggestion of decay. His mind crumbled away at the edges, the remains floating away into a vacuum. Memory, experience, sensation eroded. It was a good feeling. "My name is Harry Truman. Harry Truman. Truman. Tanith swept across the room to recover the abandoned mask. She clasped it in both hands, stared into its hollow eyes, and smiled at the empty grin. "How sad," she pronounced. Benny was a weight against Ace's side, propped upright only by Ace's strained efforts to hold her. Ace's experience of journeying from the cellar was one of exertion, of stumbling in the darkness, of grim silence, broken by Benny's infrequent mumbling. Not that she minded. There were bodies in the cellar, maybe 20 or 30. Serious collateral damage. No, sod the euphemisms. Corpses, men and women, old and young. Ace couldn't blame Benny for freaking out. They'd found the body of a little boy on the edge of one pile. Better preserved than the rest, he could only have been there for a few days. Benny crouched over his body, crying quietly, making no secret of it. She'd touched the kid's face, cold, dead, blue-white, serene but lifeless. It crumbled and broke apart as she touched, sunk into the skull. If she could have ignored the churning in her stomach, Ace might have found it fascinating. Benny had collapsed into a shrieking mess on the floor. Ace took it better. Her horror was more refined. Fear, revulsion, frustration, all compacted into a cold arrowhead in her mind. The desire to find out what could have done this to all these people and crush it. Maybe that was no better a reaction than Benny's. She was no longer fazed by some of the things she'd seen in her travelling with the doctor. When you're up to your neck in shit on some alien world, while what started as an exercise in precise military planning is turning into an exercise in getting out with your major organs intact, it wouldn't pay to freak. Ace had done it once and almost lost her legs and central nervous system as a result. Never again. She'd become hardened to death and gore. She'd told the doctor. "You're lying," he had said. "No, this shit doesn't screw me, period." She was trying to sound cool. "It should." The doctor pulled a sour face. Ace had withdrawn to her room for a few hours of self-examination. She'd ended up crying into her pillow for something delicate and gentle that she'd lost forever. She put an arm round Benny, half leading, half dragging her into the darkness. The bodies and the sickness they left behind them. She was already thinking dispassionately. Why should the bodies corrupt so quickly? How did they die? Who had killed them? She found herself discounting Winterdawn. Obviously, you couldn't get a wheelchair down there. But also, it wasn't his style. Ace had him marked down as the sort of person who put non-traceable poisons into china cups at tea parties, not a cold-blooded killer clutching the throats of anyone who came in reach. He was too sinister to be that banal. They reached the central cellar passage. Ace had become tired through the exertions of propping up Benny, and pushed the older woman up against the wall, where she had a more solid and enduring support. Ace slumped beside her, pressing her hands against her face and drawing in huge breaths of air. "How are we, Dorothy? Have we found the hidden treasure?" Ace pulled her hands from her face and glared with a sharp intensity at the figures advancing towards her. They didn't seem to be walking. Their legs went through the motions, but their feet weren't quite touching the ground. They were gliding. Two, a man and a woman. The bloke was sexy, but there was something callous shining in his perfect blue irises. She didn't know who they were, but she found herself accepting their presence automatically. They were who they were. "What do you know?" she spat. "Everything," the woman replied. Ace shivered, believing her. "I'm afraid," said the man, voice smooth as an eggshell, malignant as cancer. "Things have changed. The doctor will not be rejoining you. He has quite literally shuffled off this mortal coil. He'll miss the fun and games." "Tomorrow," the woman's mouth curled into a smile that bit into Ace's soul, "we are going to have a great time. That's a promise. Be good." With that, the pair strolled away. Ace said nothing, watching their retreating backs as they slid into the darkness. "Well now, Ace, there are 2 more names to add to the list of suspects." Another figure detached from the shadows, hurtling down the tunnel towards her, a flustered and upset woman in a fluffy dressing gown. "Oh, thank God!" Sandra collapsed against the wall beside Ace. "Thank God!" she repeated, digging her fingers into the brickwork. "Thank God! Harry is dead!" she howled, her face turning red and gushing tears. "They killed him! They took him apart! He didn't have a face! We were in love! He didn't have a face! Oh God, he didn't have a face!" Ace pulled her arms around the woman, smothering her in a comradely embrace. Sandra buried her face in Ace's shoulder. "What did they mean?" Ace whispered, after a moment's silence. What have they done to the doctor? They killed Truman. Sandra's voice was terrible. He was the gate, their link back to the real world. The doctor, Dad, they're trapped. Ace released Sandra and slammed herself against the wall. A dull pain cracked along her spine, but it only made her more determined. What do we do? It was Benny's voice at her shoulder, a voice looking for a lead. Ace glanced at Sandra and realized that she too was waiting for someone to make a decision. Well, it wasn't as if the doctor was going to turn up, handing out advice to anyone stupid enough to listen. I'll tell you, she told them. We get out of here, out of this house, out of the way of those... Who'd you say? Gabriel and Tanith, Sandra confirmed. We get out the way of Gabriel and Tanith. Then we think about what we're going to do. Then we come back in force, and we blow them off the map. How does that sound? She glanced between Benny and Sandra. There was no dissent. The rush for the door was a shambles, a mass of limbs and bodies all consumed with but a single thought. Escape. Ace didn't try to impose any order. She was more worried about what would happen if Gabriel and Tanith tried to get in their way. Ace became obsessed by them. There was something about them that demanded obsession. They were enigmas. Ace remembered the sight of the TARDIS central column bleaching white with an alien power, and wondered just how much power these enigmas might have. Not too much, she hoped. They didn't appear. Ace was surprised. Maybe they weren't as all-knowing as they claimed. The front door loomed up before the woman like a grey altar slab, and Gabriel and Tanith were yet to appear. Sandra fell against the door and scrambled at the locks and bolts that held it in place. With a desperate flourish, she threw the door wide open. The three women stared through the door, not at the quiet nighttime countryside, but into the heart of a swirling, buzzing void, a wall of static on the far side of the door. The void dared the women to approach it, certain that they couldn't. It was a door to nowhere. The Doctor had never realized how claustrophobic an infinity could feel. He travelled through the vast wilderness of time and space, dimly aware that there were limits to his world, too distant to lace his wanderlust with boredom. He would never see everything. Here, interstitial reality expanded into eternity in all conceivable directions. He and Winterdawn were nothing, less than beads of water in the ocean of reality. They were without depth or weight. But somehow infinity seemed to crush around them, tightening like the darkness in a prison. It was a cell of inconceivable magnitude, perhaps, but still a cell. He had seen Truman's face. He only had himself to blame. He should have told Winterdawn. Then none of this would have happened. No, that was pointless. The old man would have thought he was mad. Besides, he was certain that Truman hadn't closed the gate deliberately. How many Zen Buddhists does it take to change a light bulb? Winterdawn was slumped in his chair, stunned, almost paralysed by the simultaneous closing of the gate and the Doctor's deductions about Truman's real nature. Or unreal nature. The jokes kept his mind off their predicament. I don't know how many. 3. 1 to change the light bulb, 1 not to change the light bulb, and 1 to neither change nor not change the light bulb. The Doctor smiled. It was all he could manage. What about the 1 to neither change nor not change nor neither change nor not change the light bulb? I'd forgotten him. Sorry. The Professor's voice was old, drained of vitality. You don't suppose someone else could reopen the gate? The Doctor asked, not hopefully. I don't think so. Truman and myself are trained. If anyone else tries, it'll almost certainly wipe their minds. Winterdawn spoke calmly. We are stuck here, my friend, and there's no one to rescue us. That's an assumption. A reasonable one, Winterdawn insisted. The Doctor found his cheery pessimism unnerving. There's one way out of here, one way, and even that may be barred to us. Here, where the mundane facts of reality are locked away, can we age? Can we starve? Can we die? It makes no difference. This is death, the Doctor replied, darkening the atmosphere. Winterdawn looked at him quizzically. Death being a concept condition with no physical or geographical or meaningful existence. This being a concept place with no physical or geographical or meaning existence, a living death. You must be the life and soul of the party, Winterdawn replied sourly. That's what Oscar Wilde told me. I think he was being serious then. I knew I had to come here in the end. The ancient mariner beached at last on the high tide in the coast of nowhere. How does it feel to be free? Hollow, Winterdawn replied. There's something I must tell you. Yes? The doctor looked up, intrigued. He couldn't understand how anything could be considered important in a place as uniform and levelling and empty as this. He was seeing things from the perspective of a Time Lord, with the resignation of a Time Lord, and the despair of a Time Lord, and the Rassilon help us blunted imagination of a Time Lord. Winterdawn couldn't cope with the enormity. He was too human, too subjective in his thinking. How much simpler things must seem through the eyes of a human being. This place isn't part of the real universe. I think it might adapt itself to us. Death is sentient. There's a cheering thought. The doctor smiled lopsidedly, and he meant it. It may look calm, Winterdawn continued, ignoring the doctor's interruption, but I doubt it will last. I believe the Interstix is preparing to challenge us. I should have told you. Cranley was the first to enter the gap, of his own volition. He was insane for 2 years prior to that, but he'd built up his mental reserves, made something of a recovery. And 5 minutes in the gap demolished his mind? The doctor asked, not expecting any answer other than a sincere yes. There didn't seem to be another option. He was in a confused state, and he was vulnerable. I imagine the interstitial forces latched on to that immediately. We're better prepared, but we're going to be here for much longer than Cranley. We may go mad. Look on the bright side. It'll be something to do. The doctor tried to smile. Winterdawn's expression remained grim. He jerked his chair forward closer to the doctor. I told you that I'm not entirely unobservant, he said, staring up into the doctor's eyes. It's impossible for you to have duplicated and surpassed my work into transcendentalism without the aid of the tetrahedron. Even if you could, it seems unlikely that you would disguise the result as a phone box and hide it in my cellar. Your conclusions about Truman fit the facts, but it's what I'd think of immediately. There are things you've said that strike me as odd. What do you want to know? The doctor replied guardedly. Are you human? No. Winterdawn leant back in his chair and raised a finger to rub his lower lip thoughtfully. Apart from that, he seemed almost unimpressed. Extraterrestrial? Yes. And your 2 girlfriends? Ace was born in North London in 1970, Benny on an Earth colony in 2422. We travel in time and space in my police box. Winterdawn glanced down at his feet, then back up at the doctor. He was laughing, tears guttering down his face like an overloaded storm drain. Doctor, we may be trapped here for eternity, but at least we'll have something to talk about. The laughter broke off, cutting into a sharp yell. A thin red wheal was cut into Winterdawn's cheek. The professor raised a hand to his cheek, tentatively pressing his fingertips against the blood. There was a sharp pain on the back of the doctor's hand. He looked down and saw that a similar gash had appeared across his knuckles, blood rushing in a trail from a small incision. In the heart of the wound was a tiny fragment of glass. There was a gentle rushing sound, and tears erupted on the sleeve of his jacket. Something cut into his neck. The attack, Winterdawn whispered. A cloud was hurtling towards them from the unreal horizon, propelled by forces undefined by physics. The cloud glistened and sparkled with light. It was a cloud of fragments, a cloud of glass. Suddenly, they were in the heart of the cloud, in the middle of a maelstrom of glass shards. Pinprick pains erupted on the doctor's face and hands. His clothes shredded in the onslaught. Glass buried itself into his flesh and his eyes, his sight misting red with congealing blood. Winterdawn was flailing in the storm, knocked from his chair and thrown aside, screaming in agony. The doctor's sight dulled into blackness. His senses were drowned by a chorus of nerves. They deafened him with their song of pain. The doctor opened his mouth to howl, only to find glass lodging in his throat. The pain escalated until he ceased even to feel it. There was just an agonizing nothing, wailing in the eye of the storm.